This unit's going to cover two topics: Active Directory Federation services and rights management services. And while these seem like they're not really connected, they actually kind of are. So you'll see where there's some tangential relationship between these two different services. But just from a very high level, basically the Active Directory Federation services is for allowing authentication from outside your network or authenticating to other networks that are outside your network. So this is sort of our gateway to doing single sign-on outside of our network. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. And then in the second slide deck for this unit, we're going to talk about rights management. And this is a way to augment rights management beyond just simple file access. So by default, the Windows file system allows you to restrict rights based on files themselves, but what rights management lets you do is define what users can actually do with those files that's application aware. So we'll talk about that in more detail, but from a high level, that's things like being able to view a document but not print a document, or being able to not being able to copy a document and make a new version of it, and things like that to prevent data leakage and so forth. So it augments existing security, existing security policies. So let's go ahead and start talking about Federation services. So as I said before, Active Directory Federation services allows for single sign-on access to web-based resources, even when that resource is located in a different network belonging to a completely different organization. I'll give you a good example of this. In many organizations, they outsource their email to a third party. And if I were teaching this class 5, 6, maybe even 8 years ago, we would probably be covering Microsoft Exchange in some degree of detail. You may have noticed that I don't even cover Microsoft Exchange in this course. Neither the follow-on or the first version of this course we cover Exchange, because most people are moving services like that to the cloud. You might use Gmail. You could be using Microsoft's Outlook services that are in the cloud, Yahoo, and so forth and so on. But what we don't want to do is have to maintain user accounts in some third party's service separate from our Active Directory credentials. So we want people to go to Gmail, put in their full domain name for our network. So, for example, bcg28 at drexel.edu, right? That's my my full username at Drexel University. But I want to be able to provide that username, but still be able to authenticate through a third party using Active Directory at my at my organization's Active Directory servers. And Drexel is a perfect example of this. I'm sure, as most of you are aware, Drexel uses a third-party provider for email. It's outside the organization, but your password and your credentials and authentication and authorization is all managed within the Drexel network. So that uses Federation services. At least I'm assuming that it uses AD Federation services. I'm kind of far removed from the inner workings of IT and how they configure this, but my assumption is that they're using something like AD Federation services to make that work. And it's more than just email services. There's lots of different types of services that, things like Skype or Box or, all kinds of third-party services that we can integrate with that Federation services allows us to do. And again, this is great because it allows us to use third-party services but still leverage our Active Directory authentication, which is important. So a Federation trust involves a trusting party and a trusted party. In other words, that would be a one-way trust, right? So it's somebody that trusts someone else. However, the term partner is used instead of party when we talk about Federation services in Windows. So instead of using the term party, I'll use the term partner from here out. So Federation trust is a one-way trust, but you could also make it a two-way trust by having it on both sides. We'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. So the trusting partner is referred to as the resource partner, and the trusted partner is referred to as the account partner. Let's take a look at a picture that shows this. On the left-hand side, we have our Active Directory services within our network on the left-hand side, and we also have our account Federation server on the left-hand side. That would be the partner organization. And then on the right-hand side, we have our own, on the right-hand side, we have the resource partner organization. This is whom we're using, right? So this would be Gmail or Microsoft Outlook or something like that. So they have an ADFS-enabled web server with a resource Federation server. So on our side of this firewall, so when a user goes out and opens up a web page that's on that ADFS-enabled web server, it's going to ask for their user credentials, and it's going to go through those firewalls. So there's going to be a public-facing service on the left-hand side, which is the Federation server. that it's going to say, hey, I've got some user credentials, somebody's trying to authenticate, and it's going to pass through that information. So you're not actually providing your credentials directly to the third party. It's more or less using a web service to pass that through and then get back an authentication token. So it's so again, the system on the right is trusting the system on the left, which is the trusted organization. So that's basically how it works. Now, in practice, of course, we'll probably have a few other layers in here, which we're going to talk about here in just a minute. So user accounts in the account partner can be Active Directory, or they can be Active Directory Lightweight Directory Service, which is AD/LDS user accounts, which we haven't talked about too much in this course yet, but that's basically using LDAP, which is something that can also enable single sign-on. So when a user in the account partner organization accesses these resources, a Federation server presents a security token for the user to the web resource in the partner network, and the Federation server in the resource partners network then grants or denies access based on that token. So once again, we're trusting the resource is trusting a token that's issued on our side from our Federation services server. So claims-aware application. The claim is an agreed-on set of user attributes that both parties in a Federation trust use to determine a user's credentials, which specifies the user's permissions to resources in the partner's network. So a claim typically includes a user's logon name and group members, but can also include other attributes, such as their department, title, etc., which could be used by the resource to determine exactly what they can do with their service. Maybe you can configure those things. I work with applications in one of my roles where we develop applications that use this, and we can define, based on somebody. I work a lot in healthcare, and if somebody works in the radiology department, they're allowed to do certain things on the resource, and if they work in the billing department, maybe they can do something else, for example. So a claims-aware application is typically an ASP.NET application, although I should say it doesn't have to be anymore, but typically is an ASP.NET application that makes user authorization decisions based on the claims packaged in an ADFS security token. There are ways to do this without ASP.NET, though. So applications that aren't claims-aware can still participate in ADFS. Those applications rely on Windows NT-style access tokens. So the tokens contain traditional user and group security principal IDs, or SIDs, which we talked about in the previous course. We discussed SIDs a little bit. And we're going to talk about SIDs again in this course later on. So access control lists are used to determine user permissions to a resource. So in Server 2012, the ADFS role consists of 4 role services that can be installed on one or more services. All right, so here are the services that are installed, depending on whether you're installed ADFS in an account partners or a resource partners network. So it'll be the Federation service, a proxy, ADFS web agents, which can be claims aware or Windows token based, as I just discussed, right? So it could be claims aware, where it's embedded in that token in 2012, or Windows token based, which is a little less has a little less functionality but can still be used. So starting with Windows Server 2012, we can just install the ADFS role. And some additional components and terms in ADFS deployment include the claims provider, the relying party trust, claims provider trust, claim rules, and attribute store. So we'll talk about some of these terms later on. So a web SSO is basically the simplest design that provides single sign-on access to multiple web applications for users who are external to the network. So usually it consists of a Federation server inside the organization's firewall and a Federation proxy server connected to the internal network. Lots of words here. Let's look at a picture to see what we're talking about here. So basically, in this example, taking a look at that this example, we have a firewall that so that big circle on the right-hand side is our internal. That's our network. We own all of that infrastructure, and you can see that that's divided between the perimeter network and the internal network. In some organizations, you might call the perimeter network a demilitarized zone, right? That's the other term for that, a DMZ. The perimeter network basically is facing the outermost firewall, and then there's another firewall internal to the network, which would be our internal network. So you can kind of isolate traffic coming from the outside. You can almost think of the perimeter network as the vestibule in the building, right? It's the lobby. Anybody can walk into the lobby, but you have to be especially trusted in order to get from the lobby into the inner sanctum of the building. So in this example, our internet client is going to use a ADFS-enabled web server to try to use some service, and they're going to go through a Federation proxy to do their authentication within the inside of the network. So basically what this is showing us is we can protect our Active Directory services from the outside world. We don't have to expose Active Directory to the outside world outside of our firewall. Sorry about that little window that just popped up. So that's basically what we're doing here. We're basically shielding our internal network and our internal Active Directory or lightweight directory services from the outside world by using a Federation proxy that's passing those requests into our Federation server on the inside, which is then using Active Directory to do authentication on the inside. It's a lot of steps, but this is actually a lot more secure than having to expose any of those services. If you didn't do this, then your Active Directory enabled web server would have to do Active Directory authentication directly with nodes on the internal network. So it's basically be passing those authentication tokens directly into our internal network. So this is and this also allows you to do authentication with other organizations as well. So Federated Web SSO uses a Federation trust relationship with a Federation server running on both networks. The Federation proxy servers are often used in this design to enhance security, similar to what we just talked about. So a Federated Web SSO with a forest trust involves a network with two AD forests, with one forest located in the perimeter network and the other located on the internal network. So a forest trust is established between the domain controllers in both forests, and this design is used when Windows NT token applications are hosted on web servers. So this is when we have to use NT authentication. So we might have to, again, it's a little more complicated than the other example, but this is a secure way to expose application level authentication using Active Directory to the outside world. And again, this could also be done with third parties as well. So there are some requirements for ADFS. ADFS 2.1 is supported by Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2. Federation servers, Federation proxy servers, web servers, etc., they all have to be configured with TLS and SSL. So you do have to have a valid certificate, and typically this has to be, so in the previous unit we talked about certificate services and having our enterprise CA internal to our network, but we have to have publicly trusted certificates for this to work. One or more account stores such as ADDS or ADLDS must be running on the network. When we say ADDS, that's Active Directory Directory Services or Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services. So basically you have to have Active Directory installed and running on the network in order for this to work. But then again, what would be the point of having Federation services if you're not using Active Directory? Certificates are required by Federation servers, Federation server proxies, web application proxies, and ADFS-enabled web servers. So you are going to have a certificate server, which we covered previously in this course. So configuring a relaying party trust. So a relaying party trust sets up a trust relationship between the claims provider and the relaying party or the resource partner, which we talked about in the very beginning of this slide deck. So they configure the relying party must trust the ADFS server that issues the claims. So you're going to right-click on the relying party trust folder in ADFS console, and then click Add Relying Party Trust to start the Add Relying Trust Party wizard. And then in the welcome window, you click Start. So this is what it looks like, and you can go through this wizard to set up the trust. So configuring claims provider trust on the ADFS server that acts as a relying party or a resource partner, you're going to right-click on the claims provider trust folder in ADFS console, and then click Add Claims Provider Trust to start the Add Claims Provider Trust wizard. And in the welcome window, you're going to click on Start to select the data resource window that has some options such as Add Relying Trust Wizard. And then configuring claims provider claims rules. So claims provider claim rule determines what claims ADFS issues. This can be configured on the attribute store, which by default is Active Directory, also known as acceptance transform rules. So to configure, you're going to click the claims provider trust folder in ADFS console. And in the middle pane, right-click AD and click Edit Claims Rules. And this is what it's going to look like. So for authentication policies, you determine what type of authentication is required in the ADFS system. You configure authentication policies in ADFS console by clicking the Authentication Profiles or Policies folder. And there are two types of authentication policies, primary authentication and multi-factor authentication. As you probably learned in other courses, the primary authentication is where you just provide a username and password. Multi-factor authentication would include things like an RSA token, which we haven't talked about yet, how to integrate RSA tokens or other third-party multi-factor authentication systems into Windows Active Directory. But at this point in the course, it's important to understand that you can do this. Now, Workplace Join is another feature of Federation services that allows employees that have their own devices that are not on the domain in order to access claims-based resources securely. So this would be, for example, if users bring in their own phone, or they have BYOD, bring your own device. So for example, some users might have a tablet that they use that's their own personal tablet that makes doing their job easier, but there are resources on the network they're going to want to access, and they're going to want to do that using single sign-on in Active Directory, and this is a way to do that. So the mobile device must trust the SSL certificate installed on the ADFS server. This is one of the reasons that it probably needs to be a trusted certificate outside the scope of our organization. It's usually done by installing the CA certificate on the mobile device, but again, it could be a certificate that's trusted outside of the scope of the organization. So you have to configure the device registration service on the ADFS server, and then so you're going to use the PowerShell commandlets to configure device registration service, which you can see here. You do have to add a CNAME in DNS called Enterprise Registration on the DNS server that points to the ADFS server. And you have to install the claims-aware application by installing web server IIS role and the Windows Identity Foundation feature on another member server. So you do have to have the Windows Identity Foundation feature on another member server that's going to provide services for this. And then finally, you create a relying party trust in the ADFS server, and then you follow the steps in your textbook to perform a workplace join. In the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about rights management service.